Ja, meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen zu diesem aufregenden Talk. Welcome, Joe Stiglitz. Great honor. Good to see you. Doubly vaccinated, as I just heard. Congrats. So we hope to see you on the old continent soon again.
Me too.
Right. Excellent. Do you speak any German, sir?
Ambition.
Okay.
Not to carry on a conversation.
So, in case you heard the introduction, it was full of praise and of high praise, I may say, and you were quoted by saying that without getting a grip on climate change, nothing else is going to work. And it seems that at least in the U.S. now, the country is taking a certain turn, and even today, Joe Biden announced that the climate goals for 2030 are going to be doubled to what there was before, and that altogether, compared to 2006, the United States wants to cut in half its carbon emissions. Is this credible? Is this a turn that makes you happy?
Oh, very much so. There is a major change, obviously, in the administration, having Biden committed and the Democratic Party. What is a little bit more surprising, I testified at the Senate about a week ago, and the Republicans were supporting doing something about climate change. You know, they were carping about exactly what Biden was doing, but that's ordinary politics. But some of the leading members of the Republican Party have owned up to the reality of climate change. So that's a departure. You know, there still are a disproportionate number of Republicans who are climate skeptics. It's a distinctive aspect of the culture wars that the U.S. is going through and other countries are going through. But I think we've turned the tide.
All right, excellent. And amazing if the United States would find a consensus politically on anything. That would be quite a progress, right? What do you think about the following? Secretary of State Blinken the other day said that the United States needs to lead on climate change control because it has to combat China on this. Is there this competitive nature about this process?
Well, I would have preferred a more mixed message, which would have said, we share a planet, we have fundamental disagreements about human rights, about democracy. We are engaged in competition, but on some things we have to cooperate, and we have to cooperate to save the planet. You know, it's sort of like if the Titanic were going down in the middle of the ocean, you get into some lifeboats. There may be people in that lifeboat that you disagree with, but you're still going to row together. And that's the perspective that I'd like us to be emphasizing, that we're in this lifeboat together and we have to row together. At the same time, you know, we don't have to pretend that we agree on many things and that when we get to shore, we'll continue to compete. So I think that notion of both cooperation in these vital areas of pandemic and climate change and disagreement in other areas, I think that's, you know, the nature of all our democracies. We do that all the time. So I would have preferred that to be a little bit higher, setting the tone.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that when now being unified on climate change, the West can learn something from China about climate change?
Well, I think the one thing that China did very early was to make big investments in R&D and development to make solar panels. And that has provided cheap solar panels for the world, which facilitates, obviously, renewable energy. I think it's a good thing to invest in industrial policies that promote climate change. And again, talking about the United States, there is again a major change on that. Even the Republicans are supporting the idea of industrial policies more broadly. You know, it could be the view that it didn't matter whether we produced potato chips or computer chips. I think we realize now that that there are differences, and in particular that we need to promote those things which are going to save the planet. And so I think that active government policy, we promoted electric cars, so we've done it. But now I think we ought to do it more openly, that it's not going to happen without more government support.
Mm-hmm. The climate control picture in the United States is very diverse. There is California with e-mobility, but also with solar energy, wind energy. There are other very progressive states. And then there are other parts of the country that don't look quite as good. What is sort of the first major challenge for a president to bring America on the right course?
There are many challenges. One of them, of course, is the politics of persuading more Americans that this is a real crisis. And it's happening. It's a slow process. In some Republican states like Florida, the realization is that they're going to be underwater state. So they're facing up to it. There's more climate-friendly attitudes there. Things have been hard in other places. Texas with that cold storm, people beginning to realize that there's going to be the risk of more extreme, unusual weather. So, the fact that from extreme weather events, the United States lost 1.5% of GDP in damage. Not talking about lives, but just physical damage, wiping out 3/4 of the growth in 1 year. That's a message that I think needs to be gotten across. So the first is trying to get everybody on board on this issue. The second thing is, part of being on board is to realize that this could be a growth story, employment story. And he's doing a good job about that. It's emphasizing the Green New Deal is partly about creating new jobs, making our economy more competitive. All that is part of the broader political agenda. In terms of the specifics, one of the big challenges is getting a carbon price. Economists talk about prices as sort of guiding. It's not the only thing. You need regulations. We have to change our attitude towards regulations, public investment. You're going to need a lot of public investment. We're talking about research and development. But on the very beginning of his administration, he issued an executive order about for an interim social cost of carbon, a carbon price. And what had happened during the Trump administration, they had lowered the carbon price. So basically there was no concern about future generations, about carbon. He raised it, but from what I gather, they were constrained by the legal framework they fear, and they did not raise it anywhere near to what the level that it needs to be if we're going to avoid, say, 3.5 degrees increase in temperature. So that's going to be one of the major challenges, getting this a carbon price that really reflects the dangers that climate change poses.
Yeah, which is a request that scientists have made for a long time, and yet it's still in the wait. You mentioned the European Green Deal. Europe is in the same situation as America in the following sense. They both have had and have to deal with the pandemic. The state spends a lot of money on dealing with the pandemic. And whereas sort of climate emissions were reduced by the pandemic, during the pandemic, question is whether in the future there's going to be enough resources, enough money also to do what's needed in climate change when the consequences of the pandemic have still to be dealt with.
Well, first, the point that you raise about that we're spending so much money to recover really, to me, emphasizes the need that we need to make sure that our money does double and triple duty. That is to say, the money we're spending for the recovery has to help our economy in the green transition, has to deal with the problem of inequality that was exposed and aggravated by the crisis itself. So we're going to have, we have lots of problems, and we have to work to solve all of them simultaneously. Some of the research I've done with Cameron Hepburn, Nick Stern at Oxford, LSE, shows that there are an ample supply of things that we can do that actually succeeds in double, triple duty, has high bang for the buck, what economists say, high multipliers, very effective. So I think that there's plenty of scope for engaging in a recovery that's a green recovery and part of the Green New Deal. But let me also emphasize the cost of not dealing with climate change is far greater than the cost of dealing with it. So it actually makes economic sense to deal with it just on its own. So in my mind, if we don't deal with climate change, we're going to pay a very, very high price.
Of course, I think we can all agree on that. Do you have the impression that this idea of serving a double duty here, in parallel, saving us from the consequences of the pandemic and doing climate change control, has been understood in Europe? Is sort of the soul of the Green Deal in that sense?
Yes, I do. I think actually there's a much better understanding of that in Europe than there is in the United States. I mean, you grasp that much earlier, that in the 750 euro recovery package, there was a commitment for a very large fraction of that to be green spending. My criticism of the European package was it wasn't large enough, and too much of it was in the form of loans rather than grants to the countries that were most afflicted. But I think you did a really good job in the vision of recognizing that the money would have to do double and triple duty. And I think you were also a little bit better, some of the countries in Europe at least were better, in saying, if we're going to rescue companies like the airline, we have to make sure that they're committed to our social purpose. So when they rescued the airline, they made the airline commit itself to a lower carbon footprint. It was a quid pro quo. That seemed to me make a lot of sense. The United States didn't do any of that. Now, admittedly, it was during Trump, where he was a climate denier, so not a surprise. But that kind of recognition of this is an occasion that we're spending all this money, public money, the public ought to have a right to say where shaping the economy with that this money is helping save.
I'm sure Donald Trump is coming around once Mar-a-Lago is going to be underwater, but and it's very consoling to hear about the European performance, giving the European performance on vaccination. So it's good to hear that we're doing something right again. What are the perspectives, to your mind, about an intensified European-American cooperation on climate change control?
Oh, I think there is. This is very hopeful. I think that now that there is an understanding between the United States, with Biden administration, and Europe that we have to cooperate in so many areas. I mean, we do represent the democracies, the countries that we are concerned about human rights. There are a couple countries in Europe that I'm concerned about, and you probably know who I'm talking about, but overall, overwhelmingly, Europe and the United States are the advocates of democracy and human rights. And so we have to work together. And the commitment to saving the planet is another, you might say, common cause that we now share. The issue, of course, is how do we manage this cooperation? I think there are many, many dimensions. I'd like to see more joint research, more working together of our educational and research institutions devoted to climate change. And one of the things that I think we will have to work towards is common rules. That we can't let competition in being dirty, a race to the bottom, be the basis of, quote, a free market economy.
So basically, we have to renovate our trade agreements, correct? Is that the idea?
That's right. So I'm a big supporter, and I have been for 15 years, of the cross-border adjustment. And I argued in one of my books in 2006 called Making Globalization Work. I argued that if you allow one country to engage in dirty production, high levels of emissions, it's a form of subsidy. Wouldn't allow a company to get away with social dumping, with not paying its workers' wages, having the government pay the workers' wages. That would be unfair competition. But when one country says, you can produce, but without any regard to what you're doing to the environment, that's a subsidy. So I argued that if you're going to have a level playing field, we all have to pay for the cost of production. And one of the costs of production is what you're doing to the environment, what you're doing to the atmosphere. So, yeah.
Just for as an example, so suppose there are different levels of carbon taxes in Europe and America. Would that then have to be adjusted via trade with taxes or some other kind of levies?
Yes. Now, I don't think we have yet an agreement that is that precise where we're saying the price should be 125 euro or 100 euro. We haven't reached that kind of consensus. So I think we have to have a kind of latitude of saying, as long as you're doing really your commitments to getting us down to 1.5 to 2 degrees, that's okay. We're not going... We're in this together, where you may take a more regulatory approach where you don't allow coal-fired electric generating, you have low emission cars. We may take a more price incentive approach. Different countries can take different approaches. But overall, each of the countries has to be playing its part in reducing carbon emissions. And if we're all on the target to zero emissions net by 2050, if we're on that target, that's fine. But if some country says, no, we're not playing the game, we're not doing that, then I say the rest of the world has to have these cross-border adjustments.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I feel like we're just warming up, getting warmed up, Joe, but unfortunately, this already is supposedly it. I am completely surprised, but my timer says we're in overtime, so I have to thank you very much. It was all that the introducer said and more. It was so nice to see you again. All the best. And well, may climate change control in America really happen. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.